maybe these are the times that try men's souls, but on the other hand, maybe we don't have souls, rather we have minds, and so these are not those times. In this recording, I'm going to try to see if Hermes has a message from the gods to us about the nature of liberalism. What is liberalism? Through hermeneutics, through the art of going into the subject in order to learn anything about it. Through the hermeneutics circle, we're going to try to enter into this liberalism through walking through its content. Of course, clearly we already have some inkling of what it is, otherwise we wouldn't even raise the question. So it is in some sense, but the content, the substance of it, you have to move through that and see if, again, Hermes can come back and tell us anything about it in the course of this meeting with him. So the method that we're using is we're asking, what is the Zizek Dugin Spaltung or split, and how can that be understood as two accounts of liberalism, which together open up enough space for us to think about the subject matter. Just in passing, the first step is in the background of this is that I regard it to be true that if anybody for a sufficiently long period of time thinks through philosophy and how it's now understood, and through the most important thinkers and the most powerful or popular thinkers, they'll eventually have to get to Zizek and Dugin, who stand at the they're the bad boys of thought, I would say, today. Whatever that may mean, it could in some way be a modified version of what we used to say when we said there were great philosophers in the past. And Leo Strauss said, you're fortunate to live in a time when there's one great philosopher, who would have been, for him, Heidegger. But today, maybe we don't have great philosophers, but we have people who are in the forefront of thinking. So on the one side, Dugin has made this statement. So this is a very variegated and difficult subject matter to approach. We can do a historical account of liberalism. We'll do a little bit of that. And there's multiple ways we can approach it. We could do etymology of the term and so on. There's multiple ways to approach this. But we're starting with a statement of Dugin, which is Dugin says liberalism, Dugin understanding liberalism in something like a metaphysical manner. We might not, perhaps not metaphysical, because he himself says that he's with Heidegger, and Heidegger, Heidegger says we're still in the end of metaphysics, and yet his philosophy, yet the very thinking of Dasein, means to step out of metaphysics. So are we still in metaphysics? Aren't we? This is the long question, but it's something like a metaphysical tone in which Dugin is, as is obvious by what I'll say, is Dugin is saying that the medieval dispute about universals, whereby what he means to point to is that the movement began, universals, where he says the nominalists in that dispute began liberalism, or the first step towards it, on the way he's thinking through it. And what he seems to want to point to there is a continuation of what he's been tracking for some time, which is something, I'll gloss it this way. It's like the Max Weber version of the Platonic idea, which is the so-called ideal type. So that took over in America around a little while after the war. You could say it really took over, although it was already in America, starting the sociology departments some time ago. That was necessary for the reasons that one can glean from the first chapter of Arnold Brecht's book called Political Theory, which was written in the 54 or so, I think, where by he basically said it became impossible for people to say, scientists to, with a straight face, make, I'm paraphrasing, but scientists with a straight face to say this is good, this is bad, to make the so-called value judgments, as Simmel determined it in the fact-value distinction. I mean, footnote, I have to say that Simmel determined that. I know that Hume and Kant had a discussion about that and so forth, and Izod and all that. But no, but there we're talking, what the one that's in effect, as you'd see if you studied Arnold Brecht, is the Simmel distinction between fact values, and values correspond to the higher ideas in Plato, and therefore all scientists began to feel, first around 1900 in Germany, or I suppose as it was then the German Empire, or Prussia up to the time of 1914, they all began to feel that it was impossible to make value statements and call it scientific. So there was that, and then there was a gap, and then sort of Weber, who, like Simmel, was a somewhat early reader of Nietzsche, but who was less philosophically adroit, sort of picked up on Simmel's account and massively popularized it until it's many people take it for granted today. Almost, I would say the majority of people take it for granted today because their schooling, their early schooling, trains them to do so. So what Dugin is saying here is that the idea, when it becomes an ideal type instead of a Platonic idea, is then a figure of the human mind, and it's a human invention. So it's as though somebody would suddenly say, well, you know, marriage is just a human invention, so a man can marry a toaster, marriage means nothing. So it's the same thing here, but it goes for everything. Ideas are just human inventions, and they're only there as machines that are, if they're useful, we use them. If they're not useful, we throw them away. So this whole account of liberalism in Dugin has a deep metaphysical underpinning, where he's saying there's something deeper going on with the whole rise of liberalism. In Zizek, what I was trying to get at with the religious terminology in connection to Zizek is there's kind of like a Heil Geschichte, so there's like a salvation history in Hegel, because Hegel says it's the end of history, and equality is here. And in fact, in the French version of Enlightenment, it really is the case that the Platonic ideas are still alive. So in a certain sense, there's complex issues here where it's like Dugin's view is one thing, but I have to say that the way I see it, I think what Zizek's doing in a lot of ways is he keeps the Platonic ideas alive. Like even though he says he's an atheist, even though a number of other things, so far as he stays with Hegel, he stays with somebody who believed that the Godhead could be realized on earth. So, you know, what is Zizek's Heil here? What's his salvation? He has a certain salvation, but he couches it in these terms of the imminent Christianity, or Christianity, as it were, which is atheistic, quote unquote, and so on. So then the problem is that Zizek's idea of the finishing point, what the laws will be, what the social contract will be, what the constitutions of countries will be, how we'll regard the people who, the so-called quote unquote sovereign bodies, you know, which is still on an analogy with the literal sovereign understood as given his power by divine authority. It just switches over to the Congress and so on. The word sovereign authority to make laws. What are laws? Are laws simply these Max Weber ideal types, these little machines that we use in the use of our techne, which allows any desire we have to be willed into existence, so long as we can technologically have the means to produce it, and then those ideas are just means to produce. I think that's all these things which are somewhat known to Zizek are not really important to him on this score, because in a way he just says we should act like the human rights doctrines are true. It's almost like he's doing, as he says, the fake it till you make it on the Pascal's wager and all that. For him, in a way, it doesn't matter. He just wants a certain resolution to come. And it's as though the Platonic idea would have been discovered and enshrined on Earth. Sometimes I feel like he's a little bit dishonest about Hegel's actual position because he keeps denying that Hegel thought that history was can continue on some slim. There's a slim textual basis for that, but it's very weak and it contradicts the whole essence of Hegel's philosophy. But if you're really try to confront Zizek on it, I have to admit that he doesn't actually explicitly say that Hegel denied that history came to an end. What he does is he kind of dodges it by saying Hegel denied. I mean, the issue is, let me put it this way: the issue is there's ultimate metaphysical statement by Hegel that history has ended, but it's by no means contradicted by what happens empirically, because what Hegel says is everybody has it in their mind that equality on some idea is right, but then there's these little backlashes here and there. There could be a coup, there could be some kind of uprising, but eventually it wouldn't win. That's Hegel's main point about the end of history. This idea has been discovered, it's there, and it just needs to take physical manifestation. So let's look for a second at four versions of the issue through the eye of Edmund Burke. So historically, it's more like you have first the American Revolution, which brings into existence almost, you could say, the English way of life, but in America, with the slight change of, King George is no longer in charge, but there's a great continuity. So, and then Edmund Burke says, okay, that's fine because it came through all this development in England and it took a long time. But when the French tried to do it, it's messed up because they tried to say the heads are going to come off. He basically predicted the terror and all that before it happened because he wrote his famous article a little bit before that. And he says what the problem is there is you tried to impose something which the country wasn't ready for. I mean, the French aristocrats were saying we have these. Literally, they were referring to the general population as alien slaves, as foreigners, as foreign slaves, like because they regarded culture and they regarded being French and having a certain education or breeding as the same thing. Anybody who didn't have that education and breeding um, wasn't really French. You had a big problem in France when that revolution happened. They weren't ready for it. They had a different style of government. So the same thing later on in Germany when the French hoisted the same problem onto the Germans, which is the Germans didn't want that style, that English style of government. Everybody hated it. Even Walter Rathenau, who's Jewish, said, I don't want this. Nobody wants this egalitarian liberal solution. And also, it's false. It's been proven to be false by the what happened in. You remember the thing with Zoila and the Dreyfus affair. The Dreyfus affair. So that proved it. That was to prove that cosmopolitanism and liberalism wouldn't work. Where liberalism means everybody will be treated equally by the state. Well, Dreyfus wasn't treated equally by the state. He was used as a dummy to cover up for some French officer. The Dreyfus affair was critical for the beginning of Zionism, by the way, because everybody lost faith in the idea that Marx still had at the cosmopolitanism, that the state would treat everyone equally. So that's one sense of liberalism. This idea that the state will treat everyone under its bow equally. The other sense, which Dugin speaks, let's go to the fourth one. And then the fourth one, I'm jumping even beyond Edmund Burke, who's saying, yeah, that was fine when it was just grinding out in over hundreds of years from, the Doomsday Book and the Norman invasion in 10 whatever, where they took down where the common law got its beginning by saying sort of there's local customs, you need to be tried by a jury of your peers, et cetera, et cetera. And then a while later, you get this fake document, Magna Carta, where some lords said, can we get a little bit of special attention from the